Hello, everybody. It is Saturday night at, look at that. Popping up stuff. Lissa's behind the scenes popping stuff up, which we've never played with that. That's a new StreamYard thing. In any event, before I got distracted, I was about to say that it is Saturday night at 9 o'clock. This is the Aries Studio channel. This is Starfleet Tactical. I'm Chris Weave, as you all know. And tonight we're going to continue talking about the Belknap class and its derivatives. And because each time I think I said last time, I started off thinking, I wonder if there's a full episode in the Belknap class. And by the time I finished thinking about all the things, it's like, well, I can tie this in and I can tie that in. And there's these derivatives and there's variants and all this other stuff. By the time I finish it, I'm doing 3 episodes. Yeah, so there's this nifty little thing that they added where you can just sort of throw up the comments along the side, and so I guess we're doing that now. Hey, that works for me. If it starts to become a problem when I put the slides up, feel free to go ahead and dump it down, turn it off. So, but in any event, we're going to talk about the next version, another variant of the Belknap class. For those of you who remember Pat Doyle, had lunch with Pat today, about 3 hours away from where I currently am in Virginia. I went up to a game convention in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, Historicon, and had lunch with him and my friend Sean Barnett, who I've done a bunch of the ship tour stuff with. Pat and Sean know each other because when Pat comes to town, because he's an airline pilot, I've introduced him to Sean. One of my goals in life is to introduce all my friends to all my other friends. And so I've been working my way through that. And so this was a good opportunity to introduce a bunch of my friends to my other friends. And one of them, Merle Robinson, who I can't remember if we've actually done something with Merle on the show, but he's going to be on the show at some point and do some Star Trek stuff. But he's just busy and hasn't done that stuff. In any event, let me go ahead and throw the slides up. And of course, we'll start off with the obligatory announcement slide. Nothing on this slide has changed. This is still where we're at. So I expect that for the rest of July, there was some possibility that next weekend I was going to go to a science fiction convention. I decided that it was just too big a lift, so I'm not going to do that. And I expect it's going to be mostly yes in August. There's actually a non-trivial possibility that 15 August date is going to end up being a no, because I think I'm going to visit the Strategic Book and Game Reserve located at Beaver Valley Self-Storage in Beaver Creek, Ohio, and go get a load of stuff, etc., and prep stuff for my brother to bring stuff to me when he comes through, because I'm going to have surgery on the 21st of August. So 22nd of August and the 29th of August are definitely a no. In all honesty, the first weekend in September, it'll all depend upon the recovery from the surgery. It's stomach surgery, so, lower abdomen. I know from lots of experience with that, that the issue with that is always, can you sit? If you can sit, and then you're golden. But usually I can walk, I can talk, I can lay down, I can climb stairs, I can do all that stuff. Sitting is always an issue. So we'll see how well my recovery goes. It should be fairly trivial, actually. So these are my opinions only. I'm not speaking for any of my employers. I haven't said this in a while, but I should emphasize nothing I say should make you not enjoy something you currently enjoy. That is not my goal. My goal is to increase people's enjoyment by letting people understand more about how all the pieces fit together and stuff like that. My enjoyment goes up when I understand how things work and how it relates to the real world. And so I'm trying to pass that on. I'm oftentimes interpreting other people's works. They may not agree with that. I'm borrowing illustrations that don't belong to me. It's not an intent to challenge their copyright. I'm doing it for purposes of education and critique. I try to grab who did it. And the problem with this week is a lot of the illustrations I pulled from sources that don't have who did it, right? It's things like Reddit, where somebody just shared it, or Pinterest, where somebody just shared it. So from that standpoint, it's kind of tough to do that. So I didn't do a whole lot of that. So next one is, let's look at the agenda. So, first part 1, we did the USS Belknap. Then we did the Athabaska, which is a Belknap derivative that basically replaces the primary hull of the Belknap with the primary hull of a Knox class frigate. And so a derivative of the Knox class, the Miranda class, was the USS Reliant in Wrath of Khan. So it's got an extended housing in the back that has hangar bays. And so the Athabaska is kind of an interesting derivative of that. And then this week, and we looked at some other variants along the way as well. This week, we're going to look at the USS Ascension, which is the dreadnought version of that. So there'll be a little bit of an introduction and sort of history of where that design comes from. We're going to talk about the Federation, the USS Federation, which is the Franz Joseph design dreadnought and its variants. Then we're going to talk about the Ascension. We're going to look at a couple of variants that go on there, maybe talk a little bit about that. And then came the part where I said, let's put this in a historical context. And so we're going to talk about a bunch of stuff actually that I talked about like years ago, like 3 years ago, about World War I and battle lines versus battle groups and what exactly is an escort and stuff like that. Because if you're talking about dreadnoughts, right, that's a term that came out of like right before World War I. And so it makes sense to sort of have that historical context of exactly what is a dreadnought. And we're going to talk about the other well-known ship type that came out of that, which is the battle cruiser. So let's talk about these things. Okay, so same slide as I showed last time. The sources of this, Adversal stuff in DeviantArt is absolutely fantastic. I need to take the question mark out. Todd Guenther is the originator of the Belknap design. The strategic design, the folks who did strategic design, that was a company that did blueprints and stuff like that. They did some fantastic stuff. I don't think I've got anything of theirs in this particular episode, but the last episode had a lot of stuff when I was comparing the Knox class versus the Miranda class. And oh, by the way, somebody pointed out to me, it's like, because I talked a little bit about the warp core, and I said it's kind of weird that normally you'd have this warp core. Did they get rid of it? Somebody said maybe they have two warp cores because they've got those mega phasers, and maybe having a separate matter antimatter core just to power the weapon systems would be useful. And it's like, yeah, I kind of like that idea. So I think that might be going on there. David Schmidt from Mastercom Data Center did a bunch of stuff on this. The Cygnus X1 site has a tremendous amount of stuff. It's got all sorts of blueprints, et cetera, et cetera. The Ships of the Line cannon makes the Belknap canon, sort of, kind of, to the degree that the Ships of the Line calendar makes stuff canon, it does. There's Reddit, there's wikis, there's all sorts of other sources. Did I mention Cygnus X1? It's really, really good. You should all go to spend some time on Cygnus X1 if you haven't done that already. And like I said, all these images belong to the originators. I think all of the images on this page, I believe, are from Ships of the Line calendar. At least the bottom two are. I can't remember if the top two there, whether they came from like John Eves' work for the Ships of the Line calendar or not. But I think they did, actually. Okay, this is also a slide from last time. Questions to ask yourself. It's always asked when you're looking at stuff like this, like, what is the mission of this thing? What are you trying to do with this thing? Why would you design something for that particular mission? What is the role that it has in terms of the fleet? Why have it that way? And you can think of it in terms of the peacetime mission, and you can think of it in terms of the wartime mission. I would argue that the way Starfleet works is that they design specific roles for peacetime missions, but they also keep in mind the fact that this is their reserve force that's going to fight the war if a war comes, because they don't necessarily have time to pull together the ships from all the different places and surge stuff out from the center to the periphery, et cetera, et cetera. So like the Miranda is a ship that was designed in an era when it looked like the Federation was going to go to war with the Klingons. And so it's designed along those lines to be ready to go to war with the Klingons. But it's not designed to be an explorer. It's going to do missions sort of behind the line to boldly go where we've been a few times before. and be ready to fight the war if the war happens. And so I think that's kind of how Starfleet approaches stuff. Whereas most, like the U.S. Navy designs for war and then does stuff in peacetime with it. I think these guys design as much for peacetime and then do stuff in war if they need to. And it's got to fit into a larger shipbuilding plan, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, one of the important things to remember is that quantity has a quality all of its own. You know, people will say like that the Arleigh Burke destroyer is 3 times more capable than a Spruance class destroyer. And to which my response is, that may be true, but it can't be in 3 places at the same time. So if the issue is I need to be in 3 places at the same time, I'd rather spend 1/3 the money on each on 3 ships than to take all that money and lump it into 1 ship. And that's important to keep in mind that stuff like that exists. Okay, so next we go to the history of the Belknap design. This also is a slide from, I believe, from before. Starship Design was a magazine-like thing. It was supposedly an issue of this professional magazine done by Todd Guenther. This is a post-Star Trek Wrath of Khan design that came out then. It's an expansion of this idea for the USS Decatur, and it was incorporated, which sort of incorporated into the backstory, and it got picked up by a whole bunch of fan stuff. This is the variant here actually is the Athabaska design, because I pulled this particular one from last week's episode. This isn't the Belknap, this is the Athabaska. And it is a classic case. In some ways, you can look at it and say this is a classic case of I want more, put more phasers on it, et cetera, et cetera. I think it's always good to temper things. I don't want this, like I left designs out of this show because I thought they were excessive. This particular episode, because I just thought they were excessive. I don't think the right answer is just put another set of phasers on it. I think it's worth thinking about things like when you see something like that, it's like, how do they route the power to get that? You know, like the thing that always bugged me about the Miranda class is we know from the Constitution that torpedo rooms are manned. How do you get to the pod? Or is that an unmanned weapons pod? It sort of seems like it has to be. Are you okay with that? So those are the sorts of things that you should kind of have in the back of your head when looking at designs, because that's generally what I have in the back of my head. And so I think that's a useful approach to it. Okay, this is the Belknap, the straight stick Belknap. You can see a pair of forward firing photon torpedo tubes. I didn't get into all the details about the weapons armament and how many phasers, et cetera, et cetera. Canonically, it's a little about the same as a Constitution with a little bit different firing arcs, supposedly a little bit better in combat, and it's supposedly faster. But the thing is, for the non-canon designs, there are sources, they don't necessarily agree with each other. And it just doesn't seem to me to worth the effort getting into a lot of the nitty-gritty details. Because, like, for instance, this is one of Adrazil's things. It's a non-canon ship. You can make the argument that Todd Guenther owns that ship. I mean, from the standpoint that he's got the moral right to sort of say this is what the phasers are. I haven't gone back and looked whether Adrazil put phasers in the same places that Todd Guenther did. Because I think when push comes to shove, it's got as many phasers as you want it to have. Just be reasonable when you do that. I want to get into some of the other aspects of this design. I don't want to get trapped in the let's talking about phaser stuff. Okay, so, and this is what the Belknap looks compared to the Constitution class. You can see smaller secondary hull, but it's the exact same primary hull. It's the exact same engines. They measure exactly the same. The pylons are a little different, but everything else is exactly the same. So let's see. Next is, okay, so tonight we're talking about the USS Federation and the original Dreadnought design, and then what they did to add on to it to make it to doing a Belknap version of it. This is to the Constitution what the Ascension is to the Belknap. And so it originally all came out in the Starfleet Technical Manual by Franz Joseph, where it's listed as being a prototype. There's a ship name that's associated with this class listed on the display during Star Trek The Motion Picture. I think it listed as being a dreadnought. You don't actually, I don't believe you see the illustration of it. It does violate Roddenberry's all engines are mounted in pairs rule. It's inspired a lot of designs, some of which are pretty excessive, but some of which are kind of interesting. And one of the things I wanted to do tonight, we're going to do tonight, is we're going to talk about sort of like Roddenberry's rules and three nacelle design. In fact, I think, if I remember correctly, okay. That doesn't work. This works. Yeah, let's talk about Roddenberry's rules of starship design. Now, the context of this is Franz Joseph did the Star Trek Technical Manual, and it had these designs for these ships that had like one engine or three engines or whatever. Early on, Roddenberry was really happy about it, but Franz Joseph got an offer to sort of publish some stuff, etc., and was kind of upset that people were going to Franz Joseph as opposed to going to Roddenberry. Roddenberry was a complicated guy, and one thing that you could get on his bad side by implying that somebody else had an idea in the Star Trek universe. He really had a tendency to sort of view all those ideas as being, that he was the creator. He was the one and only creator, despite the fact that Gene Kuhn defined as much of that universe as Roddenberry did. And Robert Justman and people like that created as much stuff in that universe as Roddenberry did. And so Roddenberry created these rules of starship design. And as you look at them, they really seem designed to invalidate anything that's a pure Franz Joseph design. You'll note when you go through this, the only ship in the tech manual that doesn't violate at least one of these rules is the Constitution class ship. So it's one of the things that says warp nacelles also always have to be in pairs. Well, we'll talk about that in the next slide. They have to have at least 50% line of sight on each other across the hull. Okay, yeah, the transport tug version has two engines, so it's got pairs, but it's blocked by the cargo pod. They must be fully visible from the front. So if there's something hanging in front, if it's blocked by the primary hull, then you've got an issue. And the bridge must be located at the top center of the primary hull, which is in some ways the absolute dumbest place to put it. So this is an interesting three nacelle design that came from the Spaceflight Chronology book, which this was done by Rick Sternbach. This is a painting by Rick Sternbach. I forget the name of the guy who actually wrote the book. This was a book that was considered canon for a long period of time. It came out like literally the same week as Star Trek The Motion Picture, and was considered canon for like 20 years or thereabouts, and then later decanonized, but it was considered canon. And so this was supposedly an important part of Starfleet's history. And it was a design where they were going to do a three nacelle ship, where apparently they decided to go right to building a big ship without doing a test ship first, but okay, right, roger that. And it's considered to be the worst major ship ever built by the Federation. In theory, it should have had all this more power because it had three nacelles, but the problem was the warp. You couldn't get the warp fields in sync, and it caused it to shake a whole bunch and have all sorts of problems, et cetera, et cetera. And so one of the things that's interesting about this, and the reason why I went and sort of covered Roddenberry's rules of design, is this came out, and you can argue that basically Roddenberry had at least a bit of a hand in creating a canon source to validate his rules of design, right? Have to put them in pairs. Why do you have to put them in pairs? Well, you put 3 on, look what's happened. And so he built it into the backstory that you couldn't violate that rule. And hence, the dreadnought design that Franz Joseph had come up with is right out because it clearly violates this rule. Okay, fair enough. That's sort of the context of this. So let's go take a look at that dreadnought design. Oh, but before we do that, let's talk about the evolution of the conceptualization of the warp engines and how they work, et cetera, et cetera. So if you look at the original series, if you look at Franz Joseph, but not just Franz Joseph, also Stephen Whitfield's The Making of Star Trek. And Whitfield was like a really good friend of Roddenberry's. He had tremendous access, et cetera, et cetera. He wasn't just some dude. He was a guy that was a friend of Roddenberry's. And that book, that book was it had internal memos from the production stuff. So it's discussing canon stuff, and it's got this illustration in it that kind of looks like that top illustration there, where it's clear that there's not really a whole lot in the secondary hull that specifically supports the warp engines, right? And so what we got up until Star Trek The Motion Picture is that warp engines are self-contained. All the magic happens in the warp engine. The matter-antimatter annihilation happens in the warp engine. The warp field is generated in the warp engine. It's all in the nacelle. There isn't this large complex in the hull. It also has, by the way, that photon torpedoes are fired from the top of the primary hull. And you sort of wonder, like, okay, where are they piping the antimatter around to get it to the photon torpedoes to do that? It's like, okay, that's kind of interesting. From the Star Trek The Motion Picture on, they added this idea. Every starship we've seen since then has like a warp core and some piping moving it around. Like we got the big vertical warp core that goes through the dorsal all the way up to the impulse deflection crystal, goes along that way. There's sort of an implication that the taller the warp core, the more power it produces. Okay, it makes sense to me. You've got the bit that goes back horizontally. You can see that it's a sort of light blue along the top. It's above the light blue along the top of the secondary hull of that middle illustration. Goes back to where the pylons connect, and then so you've got warp plasma going down this, and then it branches out and goes up to the warp engines. And so the entire secondary hull extending up through the dorsal into the primary hull, that's all to support the warp engines, right? So you got this people tank in the primary hull, and then you've got this big industrial complex that's your power plant that produces power for the warp engines, specifically produces warp plasma for the warp engines. So why is that better? If you assume that the warp engines used to work with everything self-contained in the nacelle, if you're Starfleet, why do you switch? Why do you go from something where the power plant is self-contained to something where your power plant is now expanded to take over half the ship? I think it doesn't make sense that Starfleet would buy that. Maybe for some ships where you need extreme performance, maybe that even just includes the Constitution class. Maybe that makes sense. But other than that, I don't see why those warp engines are better for the vast majority of what Starfleet's buying ships to do. Like, maybe it gets you a little performance increase, but oh my God, look at the cost. You're going to have to spend this huge extra area to cover it. So I would argue, and I've kind of talked about this in several episodes in the past, I would argue that there's an implicit retcon that almost has to happen in order to make that decision make sense. You have to assume that the top illustration is incorrect, that that's never the way that that ship worked, that it always worked in the way that that bottom illustration works, which is a retcon illustration. And I did an entire episode where I went through a whole bunch. In fact, I even extended into the next episode, a whole bunch of ones like, where do you put the warp core? And how does this work? And where's main engineering? And which direction does main engineering face? And all those things are sort of implicit in how you redesign that secondary hull to support the warp engines and put a vertical warp core, like you see in this one, where you've got this sort of medium blue. It's not the light blue stuff. It's not super dark, but the darker blue vertical warp core that goes the entire distance, and it has the horizontal piece that goes back and feeds the engines. You really kind of have to assume that it always worked that way in order for what we saw in Star Trek: The Motion Picture to make sense. So let's assume that that's the way that it works, because I think it's the only way you can have it to make sense. As I used to occasionally put up an illustration, I haven't done it in a while, where I talk about how, it's not consistent. Star Trek is just not internally consistent. I try to make it work by sort of trying to figure out what's the most logical alternative, talk to Andy and Pat Doyle and some other people I trust about how to put it all together, and then just sort of ignore the stuff that doesn't work. There's different ways to look at canon. I'm not one of those people that tries to make everything fit, because I don't think you can make everything fit, because I think there are frequently writers on the show that don't understand some of this stuff as well as some of the fans do. Like Rick Sternbach understands how the warp drive works. Mike Okuda understands how the warp drive works. Neither one of those was a writer on the show. They were the art department. I don't think the writers understood that stuff. So if you're going to do this retcon and make that work, look at the illustration on the right and tell me exactly how the warp core works there. I suppose that maybe it could go all the way up to the top, but I kind of wonder about how it's piping stuff around, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not sure that you can necessarily quite make that work. So that's one of the things I've always got in the back of my head for these designs. And now that I've mentioned it and I've sort of gotten it out of my system, we'll just go back to looking at these illustrations and sort of focus on that. And what I've got here is the in-universe story is that Franz Joseph talks about this prototype that maybe they built, maybe they didn't. Different fandom sources do it differently. But when you had the upgrade to the Enterprise in Star Trek: The Motion Picture, by God, we're going to upgrade that Dreadnought also. And that's what you see on the left-hand side is the upgraded version of the USS Federation to take it to Star Trek: The Motion Picture standards. And in some of the fandom backgrounds, they never built the prototype, or they only built one, and then they really built this other one. And in other fandom backgrounds, they built a bunch of the original and they converted them all for the same, does it make any sense? I don't think it makes any sense reasons that they did that in Star Trek: The Motion Picture. So that's that's where we're at tonight. We're going to talk about the Belknap derived derivative, both duplicative and redundant. We're going to talk about the Belknap derivative in just a second. But before that, Alec, are you just going to sit there, or are you going to jump on? Guess he's going to sit there. My guess is Alec is trying to find a window so that he could then activate. He's nodding. Whoops. Yeah, and then we had the problem where
I was trying to figure out what you were doing. I was like, is he trying to vibe back here, or is he actually one on stage?
And then I just violated the primary rule, which was I touched the controls when I had a producer. I should have said, "Listen, can you bring Alec on?" Because
there you go.
Like an officer on a submarine. Andy Presby used to tell his when he was an engineering officer, he'd say, "You are on board a miracle of 21st century technology. This is a voice-activated submarine. You are allowed to touch the radio and the periscope. If I ever catch any of you officers touching anything else, there will be hell to pay. There's an enlisted guy who's trained to operate it. You give orders, they execute them. Alec, how are you doing tonight?
Yeah, doing. I've just been editing all day.
Good.
Yeah, we've got. I'm trying to get the July the Axonar update out, and tomorrow morning I'm shooting some more videos, and at the studio before it gets too hot in there, and then yeah. So there's just a lot. Obviously, next weekend we premiere, so we've got a lot going on, and. Not just because of the premiere. That if I was just doing the premiere, it would be easy. But we're helping the guys from Warp 9 Productions who are doing the documentary about Axonar. We're helping them with their Kickstarter. So I've got to promote that and all that. So yeah, there you go.
Your audio is a little mushy, by the way.
Okay, hold on. Let's see. I think it was because my mic was. Is that better?
Oh, that's way better.
Yeah, that's okay. My mic was hidden behind my computer. I had switched mics today because I was shooting some videos. So anyway, there you go. We had a great live stream last night. I
was traveling yesterday, and before I went to bed, I saw that that you had done one, and it was like an hour and 11 minutes or something. And I went,
oh, it was almost 2 hours before.
2 hours? Okay.
It was almost 2 hours, and we showed Daedalus, and we showed. Icarus maneuver, and yeah, so so it was that was all interesting. But you've got me going. I've always loved the Belknap and the Ascension.
Yeah,
and, you've got me going. Like, oh man, we should do a fan film with the Ascension. Just to have the Ascension.
I mean, it's a cool ship. I like the Ascension. I like the TMP Federation better than I like the original one. The original, the Franz Joseph, always left me cold, and the Ascension one, I'm not a true believer in the entire connecting the nacelles at the very bottom of the secondary hull. That's the one thing I kind of have a hard time pressing the I believe button on. But I really like the lines of it, and I like what a bunch of people have done with all the various variants, with all the variants. So there's some cool stuff there, and I described these episodes. I didn't say it at the beginning, but I did in the last two, that this is an episode, the type of episode that I describe as a getting in touch with your inner 12-year-old episode.
Yeah.
Because I mean, I don't know about you, but I just, at one point in my life, my most prized possession was the Enterprise blueprint set.
Yeah, of course. And I still have my little plastic, I don't know, with Starfleet Battles or FASA or whatever it is, my Federation class Dreadnought. It's like this big, and I still have it packed away. It's not on display right now, but I've had that for 30 years. I'm sure
that must be a FASA. Well, it might have been a Starfleet Battle. Yeah, Starfleet Battles actually makes sense because that came off as
plastic too. It was an injection molded plastic.
Yeah, so, I think I remember seeing that. That's cool.
So, but yeah, I love the Ascension. I think it's just an ASCII. Listen, I like the old Federation, the Franz Joseph. So, why they're both called Federation class? Is that what?
So these two are, you've got the Franz Joseph one on the right, and then we've got the TMP version on the left. Those are both the Federation. Supposedly, just like they upgraded the Enterprise, they upgraded the Federation. And then the Ascension, I think the Ascension's on the next slide. Yeah, so there's the Ascension, right?
Oh, the Ascension is the one that's Belknap based.
Yeah, gotcha. So you got the Belknap version. So it's got supposedly it came out in the same issue, the only issue of Starship Design, along with the USS Belknap. So they both came out in the same source in 1984. And there's, in the background fandom sources, some say that they were both built in the original TMP configurations, and then they decided to Starfleet ended up keeping the Ascensions and getting rid of the Federations because the Ascensions were cheaper to operate and cheaper to build and more maneuverable and stuff like that. It's like, okay, whatever. There's, that sounded more dismissive than I meant it. It's more along a better way for me to say that is, I don't feel like it's my job to adjudicate which version of fandom is correct.
Right.
So I go and I pull stuff from it, and I'll say, hey, there's this cool thing I found in this source, and there's this cool thing I found in this source. But, it's like, well, this source says it has 17 phasers, and this stuff, this source says that it has, 27 phasers. Like, which one's right? I'm not gonna go there. I'm just not gonna go there.
It's interesting because the Ascension, being Belknap based, looks cooler in profile than it does head on or from the rear. Because head on or from the rear, you're like, oh, that's a little weird, right?
Well,
yeah, but it looks really cool in profile though.
So I'm going to get to the slide later on that talks about it. But if we go back here, you can see if you look at the struts for the engines on the sides, right? In the original Federation, they clearly are angled struts, but Todd Guenther makes in his version of the Federation, when they actually built it and or converted it, they went to a straight across instead of having it come down angled into the side of the hull. And the argument is it gave them, it reduced the amount of interference with the hangar bay. It allowed them to do it. It was easier to do that. It gave them a straighter line, in terms of moving warp plasma around. It just made things easier to do that. So they had modified the design to go straight across. Straight across doesn't look as cool. And there's actually a slide, there's a page in the book where he sort of shows all that stuff. And I have a version of that later on.
Which book?
In Starship Design, the magazine.
Okay, I've got that.
Yeah. So there's a page where they show the three designs, where the old Federation, the new Federation, and the Belknap. And I've made the argument the last couple of weeks that I like the old Federation. And if you look at the Belknap, or look at this, you can see, the main deflector rides kind of high in that secondary hull, because there's sort of a recessed chin to the secondary hull, right? There's this downslope underneath it, and the bottom of the secondary hull is actually a pretty good distance below the bottom of the navigational deflector, unlike in the Constitution class, where that navigational deflector is really pretty much in the center of the secondary hull.
Yeah.
And I think you could have the engines come down so that they mount on what would be the axis directly behind that navigational deflector, and that would be a much nicer profile.
Probably true.
I think that would be a nicer profile.
Yep,
so as you can tell, I'm clearly in touch with my inner 12-year-old tonight, because I can have conversations.
Your inner geek. Yep.
My inner geek. Well, my inner geek is pretty much my outer geek. And one of the interesting things is that, like, in the current place I'm working, which I'm not going to get into details because I don't usually talk about the current place, regardless of where that current place is. In the current place I work at, like, I can have conversations like this in the hallway. One of my coworkers was doing a presentation on the Chinese Communist Party, and he made a reference to the Adeptus Mechanicus, talking about the Chinese Communist Party. Yeah, and there's plenty of Warhammer geeks in that place, and so
sure there are.
Yeah. So they're all geeks there. They're all geeks there. And so, in fact, a lot of the folks there originally met through hobby gaming.
Wow.
So that's kind of cool. Whereas like when I worked at AFRL, right, which is like an organization just full of PhDs and stuff like that. And if I said Adeptus Mechanicus, they go, huh? None of them will get it.
By the way, if I can just make a pitch for everyone to sign up for this is just for the notifications for the Kickstarter for the Battle for Axanar, which is the documentary being made by a team including John Ottman, the Academy Award-winning editor of Bohemian Rhapsody and the X-Men movies, and the most recent Michael, Seth Sherman, who is one of the executive producers of Shark Week and the new Squatters on A&E, and Josh Bishop. So those guys are going to be doing a feature-length documentary about the history of Axanar, and they're doing a Kickstarter that launches the same day we launch the next episode of Axanar, The Gathering Storm. So if you sign up down there, you'll get all the notifications and be notified when the Kickstarter goes live, and you have the chance to get a $25 off on their signed and numbered Blu-ray.
That's cool.
Yeah, cool. It's because with the $25 off, it comes to like $70 plus shipping, which is like, because their standard edition Blu-ray is $60. Oh, and you get a free veteran patch. They have a cool Axanar veteran patch they made or they're making.
I signed up for that.
So, very cool. Very cool. Yeah. So anyway, I just wanted to throw that up there. So if everyone who is in the audience here signs up, that would be awesome.
One of the comments I always make to people in all this is that when it comes to Axanar, when it comes to Ares Studio, I do all this stuff, but when it comes to Axanar, I'm just a guy that paid for the Kickstarter, right? I pay for the Kickstarter like everybody else. I'm just a guy who's waiting for the movie to come out. Yeah. I'm not part of the production team of Axanar or anything like that. Today
I had to deal with some trolls who are like, "Oh, it's never coming out." I'm like, "Are you paying attention?"
No, they're not. And these guys don't get it. They don't get it that when you get sued twice and you have COVID, and every time something like this happens, you have to go to full stop, right? It's not like you can just continue making the movie while you're being sued, because you just can't.
No, which is true, and I get tired of having to explain that to people. Like, well, why is it taking so long? Like, we got sued, we moved across the country. There was COVID. We had to fire our director in a 5-year lawsuit with that director. Who's paying the bills? Are you paying the bills? No, shut the fuck up. Because I'm paying the bills. So and if it wasn't for Dave Lanyon and Goodney Goodness, we'd still be making this film. Because rock stars.
There's a phrase that comes out of the computer game business. It'll be late once, but it'll suck forever. So don't rush it. I say that as a guy who just, I contributed my money into this too. And I happen to have a little bit more access to it. And I remember this was so cool, getting to sit in the captain's chair, watching the rough cut. And it's like, wow, this is really coming along. I mean, it still needed some special effects, and there was still
anymore. It's all there now.
It's all there now. I don't think you guys had decided on whether the windows were going to have sconces or not. I think there was a discussion about whether there was going to be sconces next to the windows.
Oh, okay.
In the CGI scene, in the Klingon Palace headquarters. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
And so it was still clearly a work under construction, but it was progress.
And just to see where it's come from then, a lot of it, thank God for Dana Wagner, just has done so much amazing work on it. And now, the people who watch it, I read one of Jonathan Lane's comments today, and he said it's better than Prelude. He said, I'm like, good. I'm glad, yeah, I think, it's hard for me to say that because I'm so, obviously they're both my children.
Yeah.
I hope that people think it's better than Prelude because it would be a shame if we made something that was, I mean, if it was equally as good as Prelude, I'd be okay with it,
Yeah.
But 12 years later, I want something that's better to show that we've improved. Because let me tell you, I'm looking at the stuff that's being made with AI, and I'm falling out of my chair, going, "Holy shit!" And right now, my intention is to make the full Axanar movie with AI. That may take me 2 years. That may take me 5 years. It may take me 10 years, but I'm going to get it done. We're going to have a full length Axanar movie made with AI, and fuck CBS. I don't give a shit what they say. Because I'm going to make it, and when it comes out, what are they going to do? Because I saw, I don't know if you've seen the stuff that this guy that's doing the Enterprise C, holy shit, it's mind-boggling. Just in a year, the progress in AI filmmaking in a year is staggering. Yesterday I was watching a Star Wars fan film, all AI, that if you didn't see the guy's lips move out of sync with the words, you would swear it was real. Yeah. I'm like, this is AI? I'm like, holy shit. Holy shit. I'm in awe. So I'm sure that there are going to be, seminars and forums are going to have to go to learn this shit, but I'm determined. I really am. Listen, let me get back to work here.
But before you do that, I want to go back to Dana.
I'm going to put you on a little screen off the side and watch. Huh?
I want to go back to Dana for a second.
Yeah.
I mean, because with the exception of Alec, I think, would it be safe to say that, Dana's the guy who made it happen? Yeah. I think it's pretty safe to say that, right?
Well, yeah. And
I mean, there's lots of people that had a tremendous impact, but the thing that amazes me about Dana is not only did he say like, well, we could do better on the set, and like totally re-engineered the set to make it use a lot less power, and everything went from being just acetate printouts to they're all touchpads, right?
No. The screens are all they're just printed. The only two touchpads are in the captain's chair.
Okay, but I mean, he did a lot. There's a lot of the stuff that's dynamic now, right?
Yeah. All the computer screens. So the little computer screens that are at eye level, and then the monitors up above are all dynamic, and he can change that and do whatever he wants with it. We can change all the graphics on the fly, and it's amazing. So Dana basically, he redid the bridge. He was in charge of the bridge, all the construction, all the painting, all the signage. Now he had a team working with him, but he was the guy. Then he was in charge of doing all the compositing when we couldn't get a compositor to do it. And then when our colorist was having issues, he stepped in and learned how to color a film and did all the coloring.
Yeah,
and those three things. So the only guy.
And my understanding is the compositing and the coloring. It's not like those weren't his skill sets. He just sort of said, "Well, somebody's got to learn how to do it. So do it."
Yeah, he learned both of them. He was like, "Oh, let me try and learn how to do this," and he's just so fucking good that he learned it. So I mean, the only guy that comes close to the amount of work he's put in, and now it's very clear that Dana's put in way more work, is Mark Edward Lewis, who edited it and did the sound design and for it. So he did a lot, and obviously was on set co-directing. So Mark did a lot, but absolutely Dana's put in more hours than anyone. Maybe with the exception of me. Dana is absolutely critical. So now he has, I don't know, he has like 3 or 4 credits in in the credits because we had to add a colorist credit, and obviously he's the VFX compositor and in charge of the bridge. I don't know, so, yeah.
And he's rebuilding his deck, and that looks good too.
Yeah, and he showed me his deck. Hold on. Animal rescue question. Someone wanted it. We had someone who wanted a cat that's already been adopted, and so now I'm trying to pitch her on. Well, we have a dozen kittens here. Why don't you come over and pick one out? So she's like, "Where do you live? We'd love to do that." Now I'm like, "Good." But anyway, yeah, that was one of the things I was doing in the update video, is just acknowledging, what a great team we have, and it's.
Yeah.
I don't want to take over your show, but the beauty of what we've done. You think of it, we had a disastrous 2019 shoot because of this crappy director who just turned out to be a total asshole, and which of course we had to sue him, and we just won that lawsuit here 5 years later. But we had here we spent $65,000 on a film shoot, and we literally got maybe 60 seconds worth of footage out of it. There were only 2 characters came out of the 2019 shoot, and one main character and one very minor character. So despite that, we rallied, and listen, a lot of that was learning on my part. A lot of that was me no longer trusting people, which is, that sounds harsher than it is. It's trusting the right people. And I trusted everybody. And I had to learn to be much more discerning in my, something Dave Lanyon talks all about in his school is discernment. And I had to be a lot more discerning about people. And so the November 2021, we had a shoot. This is at the end of COVID. We're still wearing masks. And we had the first shoot, and that's the shoot where Jeff Fagan, who had been a camera operator in 2019, had earned my trust. And we made him director of photography, which was a brilliant move, if I do say so myself, which I'll take very little credit for. And Jeff was brilliant. And then the other big piece, one piece was we got Jim Ross to be our gaffer, who's been our gaffer throughout ever since. And the other big thing was I took the director job and I said, I am not interested in another fucking prima donna who wants to make Axanar his project. Axanar is my project. You want to come on board to my project and do it the way I tell you to do it? That's fine. But I had three directors, and the first one I thought was very good.
So you're saying JJ's right out.
Yeah. And so he was taking that director job and saying, I don't need a director. I need 2 directors. I need one director to work on the performances from the actors. And then I need one director to make sure that the camera is doing what we need it to do. And so I put Mark Edward Lewis in charge of the camera end of things. I split that director's job. So basically Ted Brunetti, who was my acting coach in LA, came on to do performance, just focus on performance. And I talked to Ted and I said, Ted, I don't want you to worry about the camera. We'll worry about the camera because we've already done this. And he was like, great. I'd rather not have to worry about that. I said, great. So he did performance. Mark Edward Lewis did camera. And that team then, Jeff, Mark, Ted, Jim, Barry and Chris on sound, did every single shoot, because we've had like 5 shoots since then, 4 major ones. They did so we had a consistency of crew throughout. And that is why it's so good. It's that consistency of crew. And even when we switched up a camera or did something, and we have challenges. Listen, there's things we would do differently this time. We shot 2 cameras. We would shoot 3 from now on. There's no reason, we needed a close-up camera because Mark wants to punch in on shots that we can't punch in on because, even in 6K, we can't punch in. So we learn, but the consistency of the crew. So we'll have to decide whether we do another fan film with the Ascension or with the Federation.
That
But I'm
works
going
for
to use
me.
the same crew.
That works for me.
And I'm sure Tobias Richter could whip up one of these models pretty easily.
Oh, there might already. Yeah. I'm sure.
I mean, why not do, listen, you're working that, I don't know what you call that era. Is it the TMP era? You have the Belknap, you have the Ascension, you have the Federation. What else is around that time?
The Excelsior starts leaking in there at the end. You got the Miranda.
You always have the Miranda.
You always have the Miranda.
That thing's been around forever. But yeah, you got the Miranda, you got the Enterprise. You're starting to see a lot. But I think a fan film like that would be great. And that's one of the things we haven't done is done fan film, really done narrative focused film, right? We did Icarus, and I know John Ottman wants to direct First Blood, which is another Axanar film, a short film. It'd be like Icarus, be longer than Icarus, but so yeah, I'd love to do more of that.
You got me really lucky, liquored up on the Daedalus, because there's something. I used to think it was just a goofy design, and now I've kind of concluded that it's Starfleet started out. If you include the Daedalus stuff, Starfleet sort of started out as almost at the level of, hey, let's build a spaceship, like along the lines of, hey, let's have a parade, right? And this idea that they retconned the Daedalus in all those ships that had been lost, and then they found the colony 100 years later in the original episode, all turned out to be Daedalus classes,
right?
Ships, and they were small, and they were cranky, and they were asked to do way more than they ever could. And my God, they built the Federation.
Yeah. They're the Liberty ships.
Yeah,
they are the freaking Liberty ships.
It's a fantastic story of there's something that just it's not quite Age of Sail, but it's got this real maybe Monitor and Merrimack feel to it.
Yeah. No, I'm with you. I think that's, and it's so funny. So, a matter of fact, someone asked me last night they said, they asked me, so, was the Pasteur class, inspired by the Daedalus? And I said, absolutely it was. I said, and the whole idea, and my whole idea, hey, Wright, I was thinking of Wright Sublette today because I was watching the films of the Blue Angels flying over the beach. It was amazing. I hope you were there, but no, right. But what because the Pasteur showed up in All Good Things, that's what gave me the idea that the Daedalus class was refit as hospital ships, because the hospital ship refit is what the Pasteur is the descendant of. The Pasteur isn't the descendant of the Daedalus; it's the descendant of the refit, right? Because they so for some reason that round spherical primary hull makes its way into the 24th century, right?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of think that they have this tendency to, the thing about all the ships that have the same primary hull is they've got a standard template and they just sort of crank them out, right? It's sort of like in World War II, they did this with both ships and airplanes. It was easier to build an airplane to an older variant and then fly it someplace else and have a bunch of guys with cutting torches cut stuff out and put new stuff in than it was to change the production line. They did that with ships too. They would build a ship to the old standard, they'd sail it to another yard, and they'd cut shit out and put new stuff on.
Really?
Because, yeah, and the idea was, it's like, we're turning the crank. And if you stop turning the crank to
that makes so much
re-engineer,
sense.
and you're making all these little changes all the time, just keep turning the crank.
Isn't that how the B-26 got all those guns in its nose?
Yes and yes. The short answer is yes. The long answer is sort of kind of maybe. And by that I mean I think that nose was intended to be a replaceable nose. So yeah, I think that nose was, if I remember correctly, that nose was kind of modular in that regard, or at least they at some point they went, aha, let's do that. And so you ended up with this thing that was incredibly flexible in that regard. But, you know, people think about like the P-47. There wasn't a P-47. There was like 20 P-47s.
Yeah.
And some of it was, there was the group that had the propeller that was provided by this company, and it had this set of hydraulics for the propeller. And then there was the group that had the propeller provided by this other company. And the propellers were different, and they had different sets of hydraulics, et cetera, et cetera. And some of it was the engine changed, and some of it they're making all these little modifications and stuff like that. And stuff like that you can farm out to like smaller groups. Like when you're doing that with ships, it's like, okay, I'm turning the crank on the main shipyard. Yeah. But if I'm going to install new guns, I don't have to do that in the shipyard. I can do that pier side. Right, and so I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to waste time doing that in the shipyard. I'm going to get that ship out of the slipway as fast as I can so that I can start the next one. And then I'll do the refit over here. And sometimes it was a matter of, cut that shit out. You know, the guys in the shipyard don't know that we don't do that here, but we're just going to cut it out and weld the new one in. And it's just, it's, you know, the worst thing you can do is stop the production line.
Right.
You only, like, we continued to make P-40s throughout the war because there were certain situations where that was the right answer, and P-39s, and those production lines were hot. And would it have been better to make, like, to convert the line to P-47s? Nobody wanted to stop the line long enough to convert it to P-47s because it would go offline for like 4 months, and we didn't want to lose 4 months worth of production or 6 months worth of production.
They were making, like, they were rolling a B-24 off the assembly line every single.
Yeah.
How often was it? Was it every hour or something? It was something ridiculous.
It was insane how many B-24s we built. There's a great YouTuber called the channel is Greg's Airplanes and Automobiles. It's almost all airplanes, and I recommend you start with the 7-part series on the P-47. And the reason why it's a 7-part series is he uses the P-47 to explain all of the concepts. And so, like, there's an entire episode that's just on P-47 dive performance. And he compares the differences between high altitude and low altitude. And the other thing that changed over time is that, you know, they would get the manual, and the manual would say, you should have a manifold pressure of X. And by the end of the war, the manifold pressure is like 2X. And it had crept up over time. Every time they'd reissue the manual, they'd say, you know, we've been playing around with it. You can crank it up a little bit higher. Oh, you can crank it up even higher than that. You can crank it up even some more. And so some of the performance improvements they got was just because they said, you know, you can run it closer to the edge. You can do that.
Scotty.
It is. It's like you got to know how good your gear is, and one of the ways you do it is you move up a little bit. You see, did anything explode? Nothing exploded. Okay, let's go up a little bit more. The other thing that really sort of differentiated us from everybody else, and the Brits acknowledge this too. They said that there were 3 things that caused them to win the Battle of Britain: the Merlin Rolls-Royce engine. I think one of them was the fact that they were flying over their own territory so they could recover pilots, and the third one was high octane aviation fuel.
Oh, really?
Because we got more performance out of our engines than the Germans were able to get out. The Germans or the Japanese were able to get out of theirs because our fuel was so much better. Huh. So yeah, Greg's Airplanes and Automobiles is a fantastic.
I just signed on and I found out I'm already subscribed. I'm like, oh, you must have told me about it before.
I probably have, because I will sing Greg's praises all day long. And like I said, start with the P-47 because he explains all of the important concepts. And it's also a really good primer on his approach to it. Like when he talks about, is airplane X better than airplane Y? A lot of it boils down to like the P-40 was a perfectly fine airplane if you were down low. The problem was it didn't have a turbocharger or a supercharger. I think I'm remembering this correctly. The problem, so there were some airplanes that were like good down low, but they were crappy up high. And that's actually one of the reasons why a lot of planes that the U.S. Army Air Corps said, yeah, we're not interested in that. Like the P-39, like we said, not very good. It didn't have very good high altitude performance, but it had excellent low altitude performance. And the Russians loved it because the Russians just didn't do high altitude ops.
Yeah. I was actually surprised to find out that the Hellcat was the most successful airplane of the American Pacific Theater.
Shot down a lot of Japanese airplanes.
I was like, yeah, because the Corsair gets all the attention.
The Corsair came late, and the Corsair was faster, but the Corsair came late, and for a long time, the Navy wouldn't certify it for carrier ops, and that's because with the long nose, when you're coming in, you had a real hard time seeing the deck, and so Corsairs ended up doing this approach where they would sort of come in from the side and only at the last moment straighten out. Jesus. So that they were able to keep the deck in view as long as possible. And so for a long time, this airplane got built and Pappy Boynton was flying it off of land bases and the Marines loved it, but the fleet did not love it because the Navy refused to certify it because they didn't think it was safe for carrier ops. Now, it later turned out when they finally convinced them, no, we can do this, and they proved that they really could do it, it was a great carrier fighter. But by that point, we had shot down all the Japanese. They were sending up guys with 10 hours of flight practice, and you had things like the Marianas turkey shoot.
And you just have an understanding that it was our industrial might that won World War II.
Yeah,
that's why Yamamoto was so scared of us, as respectful of us. I wouldn't say scared, but wary. He was so wary of attacking Pearl Harbor.
It's a shame the "Wake the Sleeping Giant" quote was just made up for Tora Tora Tora, because it's a fantastic quote.
It is. The other thing was I saw a video about what, and it was something to the effect that the Germans kept underestimating our armor because the efficiency with which we repaired our tanks was like off the charts. Like our teams would get the tanks that were, immobilized, whatever, triage them, fix the good ones, use the parts from the bad ones to fix other good ones, and get everything back running in like 24 hours. And that really threw off the Germans because they're like, where are all these tanks coming from? We destroyed 100 yesterday. How do they have 200 today? Whatever. That video was really interesting. I thought that was really interesting.
We redesigned the Sherman specifically to make it more repairable.
Yeah.
Because it originally was a cast steel hull. Right. It was a one-piece hull. And at some point somebody said, how do you fix that?
Yeah.
And so they broke it up into pieces so that you could replace pieces of it.
Yeah.
And they made it a little bit less durable, I think, compared to the original, but infinitely more repairable.
Yeah. That was, and it's also interesting how yes, the Sherman, we all know about the Sherman, but you still have to go back and go, how the fuck did we not get a real serious gun in a tank until the last few months of the war? How did that happen? Yeah. I mean, the Germans had that in the beginning of the war. Why couldn't we get our shit together?
I think part of that was, we purposely kept the weight of our tanks down because the tanks were going to be lifted out of a Liberty ship by the onboard crane. And so we purposely kept the weight down.
Interesting.
Because and the reason why we did it because of the onboard crane is because we never knew. First of all, we're sending a bunch of ships apart across the Atlantic, and we don't want to be in a situation where it takes 6 months to unload them because there's only 4 cranes left. And they were very aware of the fact that especially in the early days, British ports were taking damage from the Germans. And so the default assumption was you had to be able to unload at a relatively small port, and you had to be able to self-unload. And all of that stuff added up into, you were crane limited in terms of what you could pull out of the hull of a Liberty ship or any other ship for that matter. You were just crane limited. And the Germans, on the other hand, they didn't have to worry about that. And so the Germans and the Russians were driving to the war. They weren't having to load and unload from ships like that. And so as a result of that, they had one less design constraint. And of course, the other thing about the German tanks is why use 5 parts when you can use 30?
Right. Yeah.
I always say, when you're talking about the best tank of the war, if somebody asks me my opinion, I say, okay, if I am going to drive, if the scenario is I'm going to drive 1,000 miles and then fight a battle, I will take 10 Shermans over 10 of anything else in a heartbeat, because I will show up at the battle with 7 working tanks. If I'm the Russians, I'll show up with about 4 working tanks. If I'm the Germans, I'll be lucky to have 1.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. And the were the Shermans the first tank with like what? I know I'm going to butcher it. Active suspension or something that made it so that and of course they were had stabilized guns. So it was basically you were driving around in a the chassis was advanced. Forget the gun.
Yeah,
the chassis was so advanced.
It was.
And our road wheels were more easily replaceable than the German road wheels, which were
especially when the Germans did those silly overlapped wheels.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Where it's like, oh great, in order to replace that one, I have to take 3 of them off.
Yeah. And also, I just saw there was I'm getting fed. The algorithm is feeding me all these. Could 500 Marines take over Iwo Jima? Modern Marines, right? Getting all those what if scenarios. And I've watched a couple of them, but one of them was
Velociraptors versus a Roman legion.
One of them was could a U.S. armored brigade win the Battle of Kursk? And one of the things they point out was, like, the Germans had all these brand new Panther tanks, and like none of them worked. They were all breaking down. And I'm like, well, that kind of sucks, Yeah. So there is a great, by the way, I'll end on this. There's a great science fiction story that I read when I was in high school. And the story, and it was a story about 2 warring races, interstellar races. And one was winning the war and was going to win the war. But they invested, instead of just continuing to crank out everything that was successful, they started spending all their time and effort and money doing super advanced speculative shit that didn't work. And so they gave the other side enough time to catch up and overtake them. And I'm like, oh, that's,
And the story was written in the form of the one guy writing a letter from prison to the commandant, asking that he didn't want to be roommates with the scientist who convinced them to do all that stuff.
Is this true? You remember the story?
It's Superiority by Arthur C. Clarke.
There you go. All right. I'm not.
Yeah, it's a fantastic.
I've always been wondering what that story was.
Yeah, it's Superiority by Arthur C. Clarke.
Gotcha.
It's a great story.
Go read it now. Now I'm going to go read it because I haven't read it since in 50 years. Because I'm 2 years away from my 50th high school reunion. That's incredibly scary. 2 years? 78. Yeah, 78. I graduated in 78.
Yeah, I'm only 5 years behind you.
Oh, geez. All right, let me get going.
I'm class of '83. So
thank you so much for tolerating my presence.
Hey, perfect. Stop by anytime. See you later,
everyone. See ya.
Okay, so let's go back to this. So here's the picture of the Ascension. So basically it's a Belknap with a third engine on it. And think about, how you would get pipe. I think on this one, I can see how I would put a vertical warp core there and get all the plasma to where it needs to go. But that's basically what this is, the Dreadnought version of the Belknap. And so I think that's actually kind of a slick design. I do kind of like that design. And so at this point, this is what it looks like when you compare the Federation, the one derived from the Franz Joseph design, to the Ascension, the one derived from the Belknap. And you can see Federation is bigger. It's a longer ship. It's bigger. It's got a much larger secondary hull. But if you believe that, you got a smaller ship with 3 engines, doesn't that make it faster? Well, it's a little more complicated than that, because you have, how much power does it have available to pump into the warp engines? But, a lot of the fandom sources say, yeah, it's faster. And it's got a faster response time in terms of like maneuverability, and it's just better. And as I said earlier, some of the fandom sources, when they write up the narrative backstory, they make the argument, hey, the Federation, Starfleet got rid of the USS Federation class ones because they were only going to keep so many dreadnoughts, and they got better performance out of the Ascension class ones. And so I think that, that's a story that makes sense to me, right? And that's the most that you can really say for these non-canon sources. Does it make sense? Does it hold together? Can I tell a narrative behind it all? Okay, so let's go ahead and go on and take a look at a couple of other quick little variations of this. Supposedly, I can't remember where I found this, but it turns out there's 2 illustrations that talk about something called the USS Conquest. I think the first one comes from the FASA, the Star Trek Starship Combat Simulator, I think, if I remember correctly, was the name of the game. There's a FASA, there's a website for that game, and I think that top one is actually from that website. The bottom one is just one I found when I typed in USS Conquest Starfleet or something like that. And I supposedly this is a follow-on to the Ascension, clearly the same sort of idea as the Ascension, same sort of pylons connecting the warp engines. I look at it and I go, oh, okay. I mean, it's not bad. I just don't think it's necessarily an improvement to what we had before. It just kind of is what it is. So, I don't really, it's okay. I sort of kind of wonder about getting warp plasma to that third engine, exactly what that looks like. But, I can make it work. Part of the issue that you run into, and I did an episode way back when I talked about the dorsal connector between the primary and the secondary hull, is that connector isn't very wide. And if you're putting something like a warp core through it, and you're also going to put turbo lifts through it, you kind of have to do a dance to make them both fit. It's not very wide. That's one of the reasons why I actually kind of prefer designs in that have less of a dorsal and more of a direct connection between the primary hull and the secondary hull, because I can imagine how the internals work a little bit better. I can see how the cutaway works in such a way that I don't have the problem of trying to cross the streams between the turbo lifts and the warp core. And so with something like this, it's like, okay, I kind of want to know how they're routing stuff around, especially since if it were something that looked more like the Federation, you're routing it all up top, right? If you had that recessed is the wrong word, that third warp engine coming off of the bottom of the dorsal like that, if I have a horizontal warp plasma shaft or warp thing going back to feed the engines that are high mounted, I can also feed that for at least part of it. Whereas this, I've got to feed the engines down below and I've got to feed the engine up high, and that seems to be a little bit of a problem. One of the things that I find interesting about the two different conceptualizations of it is, and the thing that just really sort of stands out to me is, look at the relative placement of the third engine to the other two. In that top version there, they all start and stop at the same place, right? You can put vertical lines and they all start and stop at the same place. In the bottom one, the bottom engines are a lot farther back. And if you look at it, based upon where the dorsal is, et cetera, it really is just the bottom engines are farther back. And that's why that bottom one is longer. The primary hulls are the same size. And the engines are the same size. I measured it to make sure that when I stretched them out, I got them the same size. But it's clear that those are not the same ship. They're very different conceptualizations. So now let's go ahead and take a real quick look at the Athabaska. I want to remind you what it looks like. It's a Knox class frigate primary hull, replacing the standard sort of Constitution II type primary hull. Gives you those extra landing bays at the back. This is not the Miranda from Wrath of Khan. It is an earlier ship. The Miranda actually extends back even farther. Its hangar bays are about twice as big. But it doesn't have the roll bar on top, but it does have the big ass phasers to give it a little bit extra firepower. And so you look at that and you go like, okay, they called it like an exploratory cruiser. I look at it and I say, that could be something like a battle cruiser, right? Because it's got those big phaser arrays there. Works for exploratory cruiser as well. But we're going to talk about battle cruisers. We're going to talk about dreadnoughts going forward. Okay, this is another variant I found. I wanted to remind you of the Athabaska class, because this is basically the dreadnought version of the Athabaska class, where it's like you start with an Athabaska and throw a third engine on it. Although in this particular case, it also has a different primary hull, and it looks like it's added some even more phasers, because it's got phasers hanging. It's hard to see in the front view, but it's got phasers hanging down from the primary hull, as well as extra phasers up on top. And it really kind of feels like overkill. We're starting to get to the, more stuff. But then again, you can kind of look at dreadnoughts in general and say dreadnoughts are overkill, at least in the Star Trek universe. So, okay, maybe it looks something like this. I do look at it and I say, like, if you believe the fandom background, if you like the fandom narrative of the Ascension class is cheaper than the Federation class, this is not, right? Because it's got the full secondary hull. This is you would expect that the performance of this wouldn't be as good as some of the other ones, because it's got so much more mass. It's sort of schlepping around, I would think. Let's talk a little bit about dreadnoughts, because this last little section of this, I'm sort of putting together the idea of like, okay, we got a dreadnought. And so it's probably important to talk a little bit about the history of dreadnoughts, because I haven't really talked about what does a dreadnought do, right? What's the role and mission of a dreadnought? And I've talked about a bunch of this in earlier episodes, but you have to go back a few years to get to it, where I talked about battle groups versus battle lines, and I talked about World War I naval, and I talked about Karl Lautenschlager's articles on the Dreadnought Revolution, et cetera, et cetera. So let's sort of refresh things on this. If you want the full up version, there's several episodes that you can search for on YouTube to sort of go through all this stuff. And there's a variation of this that I do at science fiction conventions whenever I talk about the history, as part of the history hiding in hydrodynamics portion of a couple of presentations that I do. I get into this a little bit. I should actually do history hiding in hydrodynamics. I want to do like a full hour-long version of that at some point. You can think of this as the appetizer version. So Dreadnoughts date to the early 20th century, and it's based upon the ship HMS Dreadnought, which was a battleship. And, at first it was just a new battleship. And what differentiated the Dreadnought from previous battleships was a few things. One was that it had all big gun armament, and arguably that's the one that's most easily visible, is all big gun armament. Why is that important? Well, fire control was getting better so that you could hit at range with big guns. It used to be that you had small guns to deal with that were quick firing guns to deal with stuff that was up close, and you had big guns to fire at distance. But because of torpedoes and stuff like that, they were working on improving fire control to sort of push those other ships out. And in addition to that, they invented the destroyer as a way of sort of holding those other ships at arm's length. And so maybe we don't need the quick firing guns, and our fire control is getting better enough that we can actually hit with the big guns at range. And so when you added all that stuff up, it's like, it would just be easier if we only had like big guns. Because then we've got uniform batteries. They all have the same ballistic characteristics. They can all shoot to the same range. Let's just do all big guns. There were other things that you saw in there also. I talked about the improvements in fire control. There was improvements in armor. There were steam turbines, which some people say is an essential part of it, but you always point out the Germans didn't go the steam turbine route for a lot of their ships. They continued to use reciprocating steam. Nobody would say the German ships aren't dreadnoughts. So steam turbines didn't actually turn out to be a defining factor. They were important. They did give you some capabilities in all of this. But when you sort of add all this stuff up, and as Lautenschlager points out, none of these technologies were new. Some of them were new-ish, but they're all of the technologies, fire control, salvo firing, all main battery, continuous aim, all that stuff had all been in steam turbines, etc. It had all been done before. What it hadn't been is all done at the same time. And when they did it all at the same time, they had a quantum leap in capability, in the popular term, not the small, the big. The USS Michigan was actually laid down first, but we were slower at building the ship than the Brits were. And so I would argue that, if things had turned out differently in the mirror universe, in my version of the mirror universe, they don't call them dreadnoughts, they call them Michigans, because Michigan came out first. And my justification for that is I said so. So it must be true. So basically, dreadnoughts were a new improved type of battleship. They were battleships, but they were an improved type of battleship, so much so that the HMS Dreadnought gave its name towards the class, and they referred to everything that came before as pre-dreadnoughts. At the same time this happened, there was a new type of ship called the battle cruiser. Now, battle cruisers came from armored cruisers, is really kind of where they came from. Armored cruisers were fast, powerful ships that were insanely expensive. They also used reciprocating steam, and so they were as fast as you could get with that technology, but steam turbines actually did make a difference there. The Germans were about at the limit of what you could do with reciprocating steam. The Brits were just getting started with steam turbines. And in a situation where you're really trying to emphasize, as battle cruisers do, they emphasize speed over armor, and to some degree, less firepower. When you emphasize speed like that, getting the most out of your steam is important. And so battle cruisers emphasize speed over armor and some firepower. Battleships emphasize armor over speed. And one of the important things to understand is that by the time World War II rolled around, we stopped building battle cruisers because, due to the way hydrodynamics works, by the time World War II rolled around, the ships were big enough and had big enough power plants that they had really sort of reached the hull limit. You couldn't make them go any faster. You couldn't, with an Iowa class, for instance, you couldn't say, what if I put more boilers in and decrease the armor? How much faster would it go? And the answer is it would be negligible, because it was as fast as it was going to go based upon just how hydrodynamics work. And because of that, I would argue that the right way to think about this is you had dreadnought battleships and dreadnought battlecruisers. They were both referred to as dreadnoughts as a class, because they both had sort of the all the fire control, et cetera, the new way of doing things. And by the time World War II rolled around, those had sort of come back together because you weren't going to be able to trade armor for speed anymore. You could trade speed for armor. The Montana class would have traded some of the speed to get more armor. So you could go back, but you couldn't go forward anymore because you'd reached the limit on that. Science fiction has generally distorted this history because you don't get there the same way, and because you don't get there the same, the asterisks are there because it kind of makes sense in Star Trek, but Star Trek is the exception to the rule that science fiction has distorted this. Usually what ends up happening is people just build bigger and better stuff. And so frequently in science fiction, you end up with battleships and then dreadnoughts and then super dreadnoughts and then super duper dreadnoughts and super duper duper dreadnoughts. And and they all sort of stay together. And that's not really kind of how navies work. One of the reasons why I like David Weber's stuff is that David actually has an explanation as to how all that worked. There were no battle cruisers battleships in Manticore because Manticore wasn't building battleships when the battleship as defined was the ultimate in firepower. They went right to building dreadnoughts. But on Haven, the Haven side of things, they did build battleships and they kept them around because they used them for internal security work. So there's a rebellion on a planet. I need to go crush it with some naval forces. I'll send battleships. I'm not going to send battleships to fight his ships because for technical reasons having to do with the universe, you wouldn't want to do that. But they kept them around because they had this alternate thing that they could do with them that made sense in that universe. Star Trek, the way warp technology works, you kind of have the equivalent of that hydrodynamic limit, right? Warp 10 is the limit under the new warp scale. It's harder, it gets harder and harder and harder to go faster. And as a result of that, you kind of have that same sort of deal there. And so, I can look at the Star Trek universe and sort of say, yeah, okay, I can sort of think about that and I can get to a very similar answer. Now, now that I've told you this, I'm going to kind of set it aside, but I think it's important to always cover the historical stuff and relay it to stuff that happens in the real world. I always say that this show, there are two different canonical versions of this show. Science fiction with some naval history thrown in, and naval history with some science fiction thrown in. And so I always try to do both in an episode. The other thing about in Star Trek, ships stay around a long time because you're not immersing them in a corrosive substance. And I think what ends up happening is you're constantly upgrading ships, and you only really get rid of a ship when you can't figure out a job for it that can't be better done by a new ship that you have enough of. And so you just keep stuff around and you improve the design. And eventually you get to the point where it's like, yeah, I just can't improve that anymore. So I'm going to decommission those ships. And this explains why there's Mirandas around during the time of Next Gen, because the Miranda had a really long design lifetime. They built a metric shit ton of them, and they were able to upgrade them. Both new ones coming off the line at the end of the run were much more capable than what we saw in Wrath of Khan. And in addition to that, they were upgraded over the years, and eventually they got to the point where they couldn't upgrade them anymore. Now, we all know the real reason is they had a bunch of Miranda models, and as a result, they were inclined to pull those out and turn them into, whenever they needed a ship, hey, we can just make it a Miranda of some flavor. Like the USS Bozeman, they added some stuff that was originally intended to be antennas, but it always gets interpreted as being guns. They added a bunch of stuff, and hey, presto changeo, we've got a new ship. So yeah, that's how it ends up happening in the real world. The real world aspect is that it's a TV show production aspect, but I can tell a story based upon how real world navies work that can justify why, I can come up with an explanation for that. So I also tossed out the Icarus last week, and the Icarus is a very interesting design because you look at it from the side and it's like, okay, it's just kind of a Belknap, except it doesn't have the photon torpedo tubes at the base of the dorsal connector, but Oh, wait a minute, it's got photon torpedo tubes underneath the engines. Oh, and when I look at it from the front, it's got 4 engines. Okay, so I'm going to assume that with 4 engines, it's faster than if it only had 3. And it's got the extra mass of another engine, but it's still got the stripped down primary hull, et cetera, et cetera. And so, or an extra 2 engines. And so I kind of looked at that and I thought to myself, how much does an engine mass? Because the thing about World War I dreadnoughts versus World War I battle cruisers is battle cruisers were actually bigger. Their displacement was very similar. The battle cruiser wasn't a smaller ship. It was the same size. It displaced about the same amount. It had twice as many boilers, and as a result, it had a lot less armor, but they massed about the same amount. And I can look at this and go, okay, if I start with an Ascension and I add another engine, but I don't do anything to the primary hull, I don't have the extra pylon, I don't increase the size of the secondary hull, I can easily convince myself that something like this is approximately the same mass as the Ascension class dreadnought. And so, what good is a dreadnought without a battle cruiser to complement it? And I can sort of think of what's my concept of operations for using these? I've got the dreadnought that's got more firepower, maybe stronger shields. It's got more capability along those lines. And then I've got the battle cruiser that, it's got a bunch of photon torpedoes. And it's, I can sort of think of this I've got the one ship, it's got a bunch of phasers and it's got all that extra capability. This thing's got photon torpedoes. I can tell a story that makes these 2 ships complementary and part of a overarching Starfleet tactical concept on how they're going to fight wars. One of the things that we see before the Dominion War comes along, we generally in Star Trek, we see individual ship actions. Sometimes it might be as much as a 2-on-2 or something like that. We see that a little bit with the Organian Peace Treaty and a few other instances. But in general, it's like 1v1s. And so you don't really get to see anything that looks like a fleet action until you get to see things like Wolf 359 and the Dominion War, et cetera, et cetera. And so, we don't have a real good, and even there, we don't have a real good feel for how Starfleet thinks about these things and how their acquisition policy supports this. But I think I can tell a good story on this. That's that illustration on the right-hand side. That's that illustration I was talking to Alec about the warp pylons and where I think it is. I've included this in the last 2 episodes, so I didn't do the full-up version of that. It's also worth pointing out that, you could do this 4-engine extra photon torpedo thing with the Athabaska class if you wanted to. You really wanted to get carried away. And in that class, in that situation, I think it would mass more than a standard Ascension. But I like this idea that I've got the fast ship that has a lot of photon torpedoes, and then I've got this other ship that's more phaser oriented and perhaps has stronger shields. So why and why not on doing something like that? And so this part, there's a couple of slides here that I will admit I'm not fully happy with how I'm presenting this. I spent a lot of time thinking about this. And trying to figure out how to sort of present my thinking in this, but part of it is getting it out of my head in a format that works well in PowerPoint. I haven't quite gotten to. So that's the long-winded way of saying that at some point I'm going to have a little bit of an inspiration, and I'm going to dive back into this at some point in the future. But for now, okay, so we've got this idea of putting together dreadnoughts and battle cruisers and putting them together. But the thing is, dreadnoughts and battle cruisers, World War I was really sort of a battle line tactics sort of thing, right? So you've got a battle line, and the purpose of the battle line is to make command and control work, to allow you to have concentration of fire. You're dealing with the fact that your speed is relatively low compared to your weapons range, right? I can reach out and hit something 20 kilometers away. To go 20 kilometers may take me 45 minutes. That's a long distance away, right? Takes a while to get there. I'm not moving very fast. My guns have more influence than my speed does. So the battle line is sort of a way of dealing with that fact. And so I need to emphasize the command and control piece, et cetera, because I'm not going to be able to use speed to make up for that. So I need to get the command and control. I need to get the concentration of fire working. I need to plan it all out so that I can manipulate the line to manipulate the other guy's line so that I can concentrate and win the battle. The role of the battle cruiser in the battle line was twofold. One was to provide scouting forces to go out and look for the enemy and screening and stuff like that. And then the other one was to be at the vanguard of the line, because I'm going to be trying to move my line up. And in a perfect world, I'm going to try to cut in front of the other guy and force him to bend his line. And if I do that right, in a perfect world, I want to cross a T. Everybody's going to work to avoid crossing the T. So you're probably going to end up parallel, and you're probably going to end up with a race to the front to try to force the other guy to maneuver in a way that is advantageous to you and disadvantageous to him. Now, you may recall I did an episode where I talked about the U.S. Navy had an entirely different plan that they kept secret. Look for the Trent Hone episode, because Trent Hone is the historian who first sort of announced that, first wrote about it, about how we had a secret plan that was based upon the idea that our ships were too slow to make that work, so we weren't going to play that game. We were going to go the other direction. But everybody else, including the Royal Navy, assumed we were going to go, assumed that everybody was going to do that thing. And you needed battle cruisers at the front of the line, because my battle cruisers were going to be racing his battle cruisers to get the position. So it's sort of like in basketball, right? The first guy who gets there and plants his feet owns the spot. Battle cruisers are also relevant to the question of commerce rating and protection. The idea is basically they can outfight anything they can't outrun. They can outrun anything they can't outfight. And if you got enough of them, you could gang up on stuff you can't outfight, right? Maybe one-on-one versus a battleship, that's a bad idea. But hey, if it's 2-on-1 or 3-on-1, that's great. But if there's only one of me and I'm up against a battleship, I'll run away. So I think that you can sort of run this through the Star Trek converter and think about this in terms of things like photon torpedoes need speed and maneuver to use them properly. And so I think that Icarus design works really well as a battle cruiser, because it has the engines that give it the speed and maneuver, and it's got photon torpedoes. And so I can think of a world where instead of having, the way that the tactics work is that it's not about maintaining a battle line. It's about being able to have some ships envelop, some ships do other things, and they're acting more like airplanes than they are like ships, and that they're not in a tight formation. And if you're going to use photon torpedoes, which are a very powerful weapon, you need to work hard to put those photon torpedoes in the right place. Phasers, I can just, as long as it's within my field of arc, I can just shoot. Photon torpedoes require more work. They require more finesse. They require more speed and more maneuver. And I think that Icarus design gets you that. And as a result, now you've got a photon torpedo equipped ship that you can use in conjunction with the Dreadnought. And so I describe this as using the performance of the ship to overcome the performance limitations of the weapon. Photon torpedoes have some performance limitations. They do have the advantage that you can fire them at warp, and that's another good reason to have that ship around, is because I've got a warp combat capability. But they are limited in sort of the performance envelopes and how far you can shoot, et cetera, et cetera. And so you get around that by adding performance into the ship. I think I can tell a good story on that. And so that's why I think that Icarus version might work well with this. So another way to look at that is in this chart, and boy, that's actually hard to read. Let me take me out of the picture. Actually, I can't do it that way. That's what I want. Make that a little bit more readable. And so the way to read this chart is there's sort of an area of interest on the left-hand side. Then we've got the World War I Royal Navy. I also added the Age of Sail in there. And I know that that's a really weird combination. How is the World War I Royal Navy like the Age of Sail? The answer is it's not. But for the things I want to talk about to do the compare and contrast with, the factors that I'm talking about for this chart, I'm leaving out the things that really make the Age of Sail different from the World War I Royal Navy. So the factors that differentiate those two aren't on the chart as a general rule, with the exception of a few things that I put in red to sort of differentiate it. Everything in black basically applies to both, unless there's something in red next to it that modifies that particular line. Then let's compare it to the modern United States Navy and then to Starfleet. And so the context and all this stuff is the Royal Navy Age of Sail are both two-dimensional surface combat. You know, you're on the surface of the ocean. You don't have to worry about air stuff. You don't have to worry about undersea. Modern USN is a three-dimensional model. Actually, I guess you could say the first one is one-dimensional, one media. It's a three-dimensional model. You got three media. You've got undersea. You've got the air in addition to the surface. Starfleet, you've only got the one media. It's all in space, but it is three-dimensional in that it goes in all different directions. But there's no performance advantage I get from like having airplanes that don't have to deal with the ocean. I don't get that performance advantage that I've talked about in other episodes. The Royal Navy and the Age of Sail were both all about the battle line. It was about maintaining the concentration of firepower. It was about command and control. It was about making all that other stuff happen. The modern United States Navy does not organize in terms of a battle line. In World War II, you had the gun line, the battle line for battleships. They would form a battle line if they were going to do a surface action, for all the reasons why in World War I you'd form a battle line. But most of the time they operated in the form of battle groups. And the thing about battle groups, what made them different was that you had like an aircraft carrier and you had escorts around them. The escorts had their own specific roles. They were designed to be different because they had a specific role and they had a role in the battle. This differentiates them from Age of Sail. Frigates didn't fight in the battle line. Frigates didn't add anything to the battle line. You left the frigates out. Frigates were their own thing, and you had other ships that functioned as auxiliaries. They would do mail runs and stuff like that, but they weren't escorts. They did not fight in the big battles. Starfleet, most of the time what we see is sort of ad hoc formations. You never get the impression that there's a group of ships that do this, you know, that spend all their time together, right? In the US Navy in the 1930s, you know, you had a squadron of ships that was a formalized squadron. As a general rule, if one of the ships deployed, all four of them did. And then you had squadrons that you added together and you formed the battle line. In Starfleet, it seems much more ad hoc. And their sort of rationale for doing it the way they do it is, you know, their tactical rationales. You've got mutual reinforcement. They've got some flexibility there. They've got mutual reinforcement. But when push comes to shove, the ships are really, you have more capability or you have less capability, but it's not really about this ship is designed to do this particular thing. Now, in the Dominion War, you get some small ships that sort of function like fighters, and that's a little bit different. But when you're talking about ship types, That's how it really kind of works in Starfleet. It's like, you've got big ships, you got small ships, but they all sort of like, you just sort of figure out where to put them in the battle. They don't really differentiate by the mission that they're trying to do in terms of like what they were built to do when it comes to combat. So Mirandas are second line ships, or doing all the survey work, et cetera, in peacetime. But in battle, Mirandas and Constitutions fight side by side and don't really seem to differentiate what they do. So for the World War I Royal Navy, the battleships are in the battle line. The escorts are going off and doing, in this case, destroyers are going off to conduct torpedo attacks and stuff like that. And the cruisers do scouting and anti-scouting and stuff like that type roles. That differentiates from the Royal Navy in the Age of Sail, because you didn't have any escorts in the Age of Sail. You had ships of the line and you had everything else. And everything else didn't fight in a big fleet action. And then instead of having cruisers to scout, you had frigates, a ship called a frigate, which is totally different from a modern frigate. In fact, a cruiser and a frigate basically were the same type of ship. Back then they called it a frigate. Now you call it a cruiser. Or at least in World War II, a World War II type cruiser. Cruisers have changed over time as well. In the modern U.S. Navy, you basically bifurcate to carriers. I should have included amphibs here because I didn't really spend a whole lot of time with the amphibs. I have an unfortunate tendency to leave them out. My apologies to the amphib people in the crowd. But you have like the high value unit, and you have escorts in the form of cruisers and destroyers that will protect the high value unit. In Starfleet, it's like I said, it's really just kind of whatever is available. And that's, in a lot of ways, it's kind of reminiscent of the Age of Sail, in that I can see a situation in Starfleet where you'd say, yeah, hospital ship, you don't really contribute a whole lot, so you're going to sit this battle out. But for the rest of it, it's just like, come on, guys, we're going to go have a fight. And it doesn't mean that there's not tactics once they get there, but there doesn't seem to be a case of your role in the battle is always going to be to do the X thing, in the same way that with destroyers had a very specifically defined set of missions that they could be assigned to, and they wouldn't be assigned to other missions. In World War I Royal Navy, poor sensors, limited scouting. They were always trying to find the enemy. There was always issues with, like in the North Sea, it gets foggy. So you're not just horizon limited, you're haze limited. The modern U.S. Navy has excellent sensors, some of which are not actually as part of the battle group. And in Starfleet's sensors are magic. And they've got ships that go out and do scouting, and everything is magic, and they've got close to perfect situational awareness. Weapons-wise, in the World War I Royal Navy and the Age of Sail, there's really a limited ability to hit targets. It's hard. You got to fire a lot of shots to hit the targets. And weapons greatly outrange propulsion. And that goes back to what I was saying before. Like, I can shoot 20,000 yards and my shells get there in a minute. I can, but to actually sail 20,000 yards might take me 45 minutes to get there at full speed. And so I have a lot more influence with my guns. It's not really about, if I move the guns, if I'm trying to move the guns, it takes a long time to do that. The modern U.S. Navy weapons really outrange propulsion, even more so. Like, instead of moving 20,000 yards in 45 minutes versus shooting 20,000 yards in 5 minutes, it's shooting 200 miles in the distance it takes, in the time it takes me to, or 400 miles in the time it takes me to sail 20,000 yards. Because I've got long range missiles, I can shoot a long way. And some of those missiles are called airplanes, and they have their own missiles. And there's generally an excellent ability to hit the target. If I can see it, I can probably hit it. Starfleet, you've got an excellent ability to hit target, but propulsion way outranges weapons. And by that, I mean, you can move really, really fast. And so you kind of have to move really, really fast. You have to maneuver to get your weapon within range. And in some ways, that's like the Age of Sail, because you move so slowly and your weapons were your weapon range in the Age of Sail was so limited. I say even for the Age of Sail weapons outrange propulsion, that's because I'm shooting 300 yards, but I'm only moving like a knot or two. I'm moving really slow. Whereas in Starfleet, you know, I can zoom all over the place. If I need to move to put a weapon in a particular place, I can do that as a general rule. So for a tactical summary, I would say for the World War I Royal Navy, battle line tactics are necessary to optimize the use of World War I era dreadnoughts by allowing concentration and maximization of firepower. And it's really sort of based on attrition. You're trying to knock the other guy out one ship at a time. Speed and maneuver are important because they are hard, right? So the difference between a fast and a slow ship in the World War I Royal Navy is 5 knots. That's it. 5 knots. 8 miles per hour approximately is 6 to 8 miles per hour is the difference between a fast ship and a slow ship. That's really kind of crazy. Now it's a huge percentage of the total, but you're moving really slow. I mean, that's because because propulsion is so hard, that makes it a huge proportion of the total. And so small differences really matter because they're hard to get small differences. I would argue in the Age of Sail, the importance of speed and maneuver is largely situational. It has a lot to do with the wind. It has a lot to do with, like, are you escorting, et cetera, et cetera. It's harder to make sort of a blanket statement about the Age of Sail than it is about the World War I Royal Navy. And the modern U.S. Navy battle group tactics are based on protecting the high-value unit. It's really like, I've got the basket that has all the eggs in it, and then I've got a bunch of things around the outside that are defending that basket. But the funny thing is that speed and maneuver are not really relevant in a missile age. Like, it's the speed and range of the missiles that matters. It's the ability to attack effectively first, as Wayne Hughes would put it in the book Fleet Tactics. It's about your sensor capability. And so, like, if I can detect something within the range of my weapons, I can generally fire weapons at it and hit it. And I might be shooting at a target that's 200 miles away. And, you know, if a missile's coming in at Mach 2 and I'm moving 20 knots, I'm effectively standing still as far as that missile is concerned. It doesn't matter. I'm not going to outmaneuver the missile. I'm not going to outmaneuver the ship firing the missile. Once I'm in a firing position, that's kind of it. For Starfleet, squadron tactics really allow the flexibility to take advantage of superior command and control sorts of things, weapons and propulsion, precision and maneuver. So you've got all these advantages, and speed and maneuver are largely trivial because everything else just works. And I just realized I missed the limitations line. So let me go back and talk about limitations. World War I Royal Navy, poor maneuverability, poor speed, that sort of stuff. And basically poor everything. Command, control, communications, computers, what computers? Intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, targeting. All those things were really, really hard to do, and they weren't very good at it. And you had some changes in their ability to do it that came about in the World War I era. That's what made dreadnoughts dreadnoughts. One of it was the fire control integration picture of the problem, or part of the picture that solved a lot of the problems that they had. But it's still, you know, even compared to modern stuff, it's like they were piss poor at all that stuff. The modern U.S. Navy is really pretty good about that stuff, but they have a lot of offboard support to make it happen. They're not self-contained, whereas Starfleet is basically self-contained and is able to do all that stuff. And I jokingly say the main limitation on Starfleet is that writers don't know how navies actually work. And so the main limitation in sort of how Starfleet does stuff is sort of a lack of imagination in terms of if I had all these capabilities, I could do all these really cool things with them that I'm not convinced that the writers know how to do. And so I would argue, and this is as close to a conclusion on this slide as I can get, I would argue that Starfleet is sort of this weird love child of the Age of Sail and the modern U.S. Navy. And that it's got all this tremendous capability. It can do all this targeting. It can shoot a long distance. It, you know, except except the exception to that is that the speed and maneuver stuff actually does make a difference for them. And the reason why I say I add the age of sail into that is because, with the exception of the carrier escort divide, like a destroyer and a cruiser, the difference is how many fire control directors you have and how many missile tubes you have. It's not really about, it's a lot like the age of sail, in that in the age of sail you had like a 74 gun ship and you had an 80 gun ship and you had like a 100 gun ship, et cetera, et cetera. It was really more just about size and, are you a liner fast or a liner slow? What sort of capability do you have in terms of speed? But when push came to shove, that's really the only thing I cared about, was how many guns you brought to the line of battle. Once you made the threshold of, yes, you can stand in the line of battle, you have sufficient firepower and sufficiently large guns that you have the range to actually add to it, it doesn't really matter. Whether you don't have the equivalent of a destroyer versus a cruiser versus a battleship in the age of sail. Like I said, I'm presenting these last two slides tonight, despite the fact that I don't think they're quite gelled yet in my head, and I expect to come back and talk about it some more and probably do an entire episode on it, because that's the way this sort of works. And that was the last slide, but let me go back to here, because I think I said something here. I thought I think maybe there's another slide there where I specifically talk about torpedoes, but except I can't find it. So I'm going to jump back and I'm going to turn that off, and I'm going to go through the comments real quick because we're running long. And I will go try to do that as fast as I can. We talked about a few of the comments while Alec was here. So let me scroll back. Let's see. Scrolling. Hello, everybody that I didn't already say hi to. So Randall Wong responded to something that Bob Hranek had said about shore leave. Shore leave is a convention in Maryland. Except it's not in Maryland anymore, is it? I think it moved. It moved out of Maryland. I can't remember where it moved. And they just had the convention this last weekend. Not this weekend, but like last weekend. And so it's a science fiction convention that I've only been to once, and that was a while ago. So One Horse Shay said you missed last week. Well, it's on YouTube, so you can go watch it. Let's see. Bob said that something was discussed by some of us when the regular panelists did not show up. I did not catch that at the time. I don't understand the context. I will not be able to fold space using the spice after the surgery. It's not that kind of surgery. I do expect that, last time they gave me some mild narcotics that did help. So I imagine I'm probably going to have something like that for the recovery period.
I imagine you'll feel like you're folding space at least.
Maybe not. The thing that I've discovered is that if you need morphine, you're so busy being in pain that you don't get all the, recreational benefits of morphine. Like all you get is like less pain and you're sleepy. Same thing with Dilaudid. Dilaudid makes you sleepy. It was nice, but it was nice because the pain went away. As far as I'm a fan of it because it made the pain go away. It's not like I didn't feel like I was, like when I was drunk or anything like that. Now, nitrous oxide, on the other hand, even though the nitrous oxide was about making sure that during the biopsy that I was all chill, I could understand why nitrous oxide is something that people would want to participate in as a recreational activity. I definitely understand that. I just basically felt like I was drunk. So the Terror of Death said, aren't most ships historically in universe part of the movie era? A lot? Yeah, there's a lot of stuff that sort of comes from that, and they built a lot of models. And so we keep seeing Excelsiors, we keep seeing Mirandas, etc. We see variations of all that stuff because they had the physical models. So it's like, we need a ship. Go back to the big pile of ships in the corner of the prop room and get us a Miranda. And so that's what they end up doing. Let's see. Don't know if Starfleet ever did something with the Ares class. Who knows? So One Horse Shay said, why would you bother building such a ship instead of another refit Constitution? I suspect that you're talking about the Belknap itself. The answer was, and I probably didn't emphasize this, the answer was, in universe, going back to Starship Design, Todd Guenther, the answer was that the Belknap was cheaper, lower operating costs, had some increased capability for the things that they were concerned about, which was primarily increasing their military capability. Because remember the context that this takes place in. What we see during the original series, a time of increasing tensions with the Klingons. The Organians sort of like tamped that down for a bit, but then the Organians conveniently went away. And so the movie era, there's a reason the Klingons keep showing up, and they keep causing problems. And I would argue that the entire movie era is an era where Star Trek is fighting the Cold War with the Klingons, right? So there was that peaceful time right after World War II, Kumbaya, et cetera, although some people saw that there was going to be issues with the Russians early on. And so, but by the time 1950 rolls around, we're rearming because now we've got this threat from the Russians. And I think you're seeing the exact same thing in Star Trek, the motion picture, not the motion picture itself, but you see that from going, I guess you sort of see it with the opening stuff, right? There's a reason why we had these listening posts and on the Klingon Empire, right? There's a reason why we were spying on them. We were getting ready for the war. And so I think that's why you see a bunch of these, stuff from that. And so that's why something like the Belknap was useful to them. They could build more of them. They were cheaper. They had an increased military capability, increased maneuverability, et cetera, et cetera. So Wright suggests that maybe it really is an unmanned launcher on the Miranda. It's the equivalent of a T-90 versus an M1 Abrams in manned versus unmanned. Could very well be. Starfleet doesn't seem to want to have systems that you can't get dudes next to do something with, except that they keep designing ships where you go like, how did the dudes get there? But most of the time it seems like you've always got the ability to get a human being to a place, because if nothing else, you have to do maintenance on it, right? We got the entire set of Jeffries tubes that run all through because you need to be able to get to that stuff. An entirely separate set of corridors on the next gen corridors for midgets, so that you can get to all these gears and stuff like gear to fix it and stuff like that. And so from that standpoint, they're clearly highly automated, but they also seem to value the crew access. So essentially this design would have been created between 2287 and 2293. I think those dates sound right. So I will admit I don't usually convert stuff into this. And this is another thing that fits in with all the fandom stuff, is that the fandom stuff, generally the individual pieces of fandom are consistent with each other. And it's tough to sort of compare across. Like for instance, for the that Icarus class ship, that illustration comes from the FASA Star Trek tactical combat simulator site. And so I thought, okay, let's see if it's the same mass as the Ascension from that same site, right? Because they're both on the same site. It's the only site where they're both on. Let's see if they're the same mass. And I came to the conclusion I'd come to once before, is that I don't believe the FASA numbers on stuff. There's stuff where it's like that clearly can't be the case. It clearly can't be the case that those two ships are so close to being the same mass when volume-wise they're so different. And for some other ones. And so in my head canon, that Icarus class and the Ascension class are about the same mass. It's just one of them has a bigger secondary hull and sort of the extra pylon stuff, and the other one doesn't. Yeah, Terror of Death said, Roddenberry had an ego. Let's just keep it at that. That's a really good explanation. That's a really good way of phrasing that. So Dustin asks the question, would the Miranda roll bar torpedo launchers need the space for engineers and tactical officer to service a torpedo pod for maintenance and upgrading? I think that Starfleet would say yes. That's sort of where I'm coming from on this. I think Starfleet would say yes. I think they would be inclined to want to do that. And, okay, maybe they're going to transport people up there. I don't like a system where, like, in the middle of battle, I have to run a transporter. That just seems to me to be asking for problems. Yeah. Patrick Ross says, if the Miranda's torpedo pod was manned, it would be the Star Trek equivalent to being assigned as a ball turret gunner or a third bridge in the space battleship Yamato. Yeah. I mean, it's... we do see it blow up. It got blowed up real nicely in Wrath of Khan, right? Randall says, to avoid making it easy, automatic stuff should be slower than crew operated. Oh, I just dumped a whole bunch of stuff off my desk. Yeah, I mean, that's sort of like a justifying the humans and all this. Star Trek never really gets to the point of explaining why there are humans doing anything. I mean, I understand why there's humans doing stuff, because we're all humans and we like watching humans doing stuff. But it's, that's just sort of a conceit of the show. And so this, I think, fits in the same category. Delon asks, where is the flux capacitor? That's a good question. That's a good question. I'll get back to you on that, Delon. So Dustin says, third warp nacelles limit speed boost, more shields power, and more weapons power. The added cost of a weight of one additional warp nacelle and one extra warp pylon strut. Yeah. I mean, so the question is, are warp engines a producer of power or a consumer of power? And, we know that they consume power, but are they also a producer of power? And in the original series, they were producers of power. But from the motion picture on, they are simply consumers of power. The power is produced someplace else. And so I think that's kind of the right way to look at that. So if you're looking at the old, Franz Joseph design, if your warp nacelles work that way, it gives you extra power. If not, it's just something else sucking power. And so you'd have to power that third engine. And I didn't really talk about that with the Icarus. The same thing is true there, so maybe it's got two warp cores or something like that because it has to power an extra two engines. I don't know. Going down, let's see. Patrick Ross said, imagine saucer separation in TOS, TMP-era involved jettisoning the nacelles. Yeah, quite possibly. Quite possibly. It's unclear. Patrick says, what is the favorite science fiction war game among defense analysts? That's a good question. I don't know, because I don't think most defense analysts play things like that, which is sort of surprising. The wargaming department in Newport, there was really one hardcore wargamer in the wargaming department at Newport, and you're talking to him. I was quite shocked when I got there and discovered that it wasn't a place that had a bunch of wargamers in it. There is the thing about, if you make your hobby your job, it's no longer your hobby. But I think that was just, most of those guys came in because it started off as a naval assignment, and they just sort of viewed it as a different thing, and they weren't necessarily a game player. Okay, so scrolling, skipping a few things because we're running so late. Yeah, right also says Greg's channel is great. Greg's Airplanes and Automobiles. Wright also points out going back to the conversation with Alec, the F6F Hellcat was easier to build. F4U had a lot of really cool things. I think they actually used the same engine, if I remember correctly. F4U was faster and had a lot of real great capabilities, but the F6F Hellcat was just easier to build. Bob says German tanks are superior to Western Allied tanks overall. I think we had a part of the definition of superiority there, part of the debate about superiority. I really think it depends upon what you're trying to optimize for. And so the U.S. was willing to trade off firepower and armor protection for reliability and just being able to turn the crank. And so, like, that's one of the things they did. In fact, Patton weighed in on this, if I remember correctly. There was talk about suspending Sherman production and retooling to do something else. And he said, no, just keep giving me Shermans. I can win the war with Shermans. I just need a lot of them. So send me a lot of Shermans. And so I would, that you're sort of saying, like, I'm not going to deal with the best tank. I think when you get to the definition of best tank, I think at some level, I'd say the definition that I would want to use is most reliable, because if I need a tank and I don't have it because it's broke, then it doesn't matter how good it is. At that point, it's not very good at all. And Patrick Ross said German tanks are only better until you have to do maintenance. There's a lot of truth to that. Patrick Ross said Icarus again, who let the Atlas design team out of their padded room. Yep. So, yeah, Wright points out in the modern era, speed is more valuable for strategic mobility. Yes, very much so. Speed's what gets you to the scene of the action fast. Once you're there, the missile outruns everything. Hello, Bill. Patrick said they gave you an epidural. I've never had an epidural for abdominal surgery. Boy, would I have liked one when I had the bariatric surgery. Oh my God, that was problematic. So Bob says shore leave has been in Lancaster, Pennsylvania the last couple of years. Does that mean it's at the convention center? I can probably look that up. The reason why I asked that is because I was in the convention center earlier today, because that's where the gaming convention I was at Lancaster Convention Center. My guess is that it might be at a hotel, but I'll look it up. Olive says spectacularly late. You showed up late. We were still going because Alex showed up, and so we did an entirely separate show for about 45 minutes in the middle, and then we went back to the show that we had started off with, and so that's why we're running so late tonight. Yes. Okay. So I'm down. Okay, so Bob, it's the hotel. He said the hotel's convention center. Not sure which one I'm at. There's something called the Lancaster Convention Center, and it's got a Marriott attached to it. And it's specifically called the Lancaster Convention Center. So, as opposed to just like hotels have convention centers. I'm going to look it up and figure that out. We don't need to go on this because we're at the 2 hours and 20-minute mark. I think Lissa probably can tell me. Lissa, is that the longest episode we've ever done?
If it's not, it's damn near.
Yeah. You know, we could go for another half hour to make sure we got the title. Let's not do that. Let's call this one. I don't know what the topic is going to be for next week. I have absolutely no idea. I'm going to do some thinking about that tomorrow. Like I said, there's some stuff here. I haven't talked about World War I naval and how this all fits together, and et cetera, et cetera. I frequently come back to topics because I haven't talked about something in a while, and it's cool, and I think I can say something about it. And also because, you know, my thinking changes over time. As I study more science fiction and I study more real-world tactics, my thinking on stuff will get. Sometimes it changes radically in that I conclude that I was wrong about something. More often, it's just sort of like it's like, okay, there's another piece of this puzzle that I hadn't fully appreciated that now I can pull into the story. And so I'm pretty sure that's that stuff at the end. I'm not happy with what I was able to put together in the time I had because it hasn't quite gelled yet in my head, but at some point I'm sure we'll come back to that, but it won't be next week because there won't be time for it to gel for next week. So I don't know what I'm going to do next week. But I do plan on being here. And so I look forward to seeing you all next week. And once again, thank you very much for spending your Saturday night with me. And so I think that's actually it's really cool that you guys are willing to do that. And as long as you're willing to do that, I'll keep on doing this. And so, Dustin, your idea about doing computer interfaces, probably not just interfaces. I might do something on computers. That's probably going to require more research than I'm going to have time for this coming week, but I'll figure out something to do. And with that, thank you very much, everybody. And I'll see you next time. And, you know, we're closing in on episode 200. So thank you very much.